Okay, next, looking at factors affecting perception, we'll look at motivation. We'll look at one of the first studies that is named on the specification that you do need to know for the perception topic. Just remember that we're looking at perceptual set here, which is, an individual's readiness to notice the environment. And I said before that that is linked to our drives, and that's what Gilchrist and Nesberg, so that's the first named study. It was a study done in 1952. They looked at the drives. They looked at hunger drives. So they wanted to see, if you're a researcher and you're looking at how motivated someone is, or whether their motivation affects their perception, affects the way they see the world, using a drive, and in particular here the hunger drive, that's quite a good way to do that, because we're all hungry, we need to eat, and actually that's a very valid way to test whether our perception, our motivation affects our perception. So what did they do here? So yeah, the aim, again, remember, for a named study, you need to know the aim, the method, the results, and the conclusions. You could get asked directly about this. So what was the aim of the Gilchrist and Nesberg study? So they looked to discover if motivation, and in this case particularly hunger, had an impact on perception. And so they looked at food deprivation and the effect it had on the perception of food-related pictures. Quite an interesting way to look at things. So they had two groups here. This was an independent measure design. So you had two separate groups. You were either in one group, that first group were deprived of food for 20 hours. I don't know about you, but that sounds quite difficult to me. I wouldn't want to go without food for 20 hours, specifically in the name of a psychological study as well. The other group weren't deprived of food, so that was the independent variable, whether they were deprived of food for 20 hours or not. And then all the participants did the same thing. So that thing was to be shown pictures of food, so shown a slideshow of food, and there were different foods. So there was T-bone steak, there was fried chicken, there was hamburgers, spaghetti. I'm drooling just talking about it. And they were shown these for 15 seconds. And then what happened was the screen was turned off. Now the participants were told that what they had to do is match the pictures, match the task. So they thought they were doing a picture matching task, because if they'd been told what the actual aim of the study was, or on what they were actually doing, it might have impacted the result. So they were told that they were matching pictures. What actually happened is, when the slide went back on, when the projector was turned back on, it was turned on intentionally dimmer than it was before. And so the participants were asked as part of it, could you also readjust the picture to the same that it was before? And so what Gilchrist and Nesberg were actually doing is to see if there was a difference between the group that were deprived of food for 20 hours compared to the group that weren't. And what they found was the food-deprived participants readjusted the food pictures to being brighter than they were when they were shown them, compared to the other group. So the food-deprived participants ended up making the food brighter than it was before. So what did Gilchrist and Nesberg conclude from this? They suggested that hunger was an impact. Hunger had an impact here on the perception. Hunger was a motivating factor, and it affected how they were perceiving the food. And what Gilchrist and Nesberg were saying is that the participants that were deprived of food actually thought that the food was brighter than it was. They had the motivation to look for food because they were so hungry. They were seeing the food as brighter than it really was. So this food deprivation actually heightened their perception of food-related pictures. And so it changed what they were seeing. Obviously, both groups here were seeing the same food at the same brightness to begin with, but those that were food deprived, because they had the motivation to seek food, they saw things differently. And so Gilchrist and Nesberg were saying that their motivation, their hunger, was changing the way that they saw the world, was changing the way that they saw food. Really, really interesting study, really interesting finding. And I can certainly see how that would happen. So let's look at some evaluations here of this study and some strengths and weaknesses. Firstly, then, the strength. So yes, there is supporting research from this study. So other researchers have also conducted similar studies and found similar results. So Sanford in 1936, they did a similar thing, deprived participants of food. This time it was for 4 hours rather than 20. And then they were shown ambiguous pictures. Now, you should have looked at ambiguous pictures when you were looking at visual illusions, and it's the reason why you might see the Rubens vase is because it's ambiguous. So here, pictures could be deciphered or seen as multiple things. What they found was those who were deprived of food for longer were more likely to say, "Oh, that looks like food. That looks like a hamburger. That looks like spaghetti, whatever it may be." They interpreted an ambiguous stimulus, something that didn't actually show anything, as being something that was linked to food. And again, that backs up what Gilchrist and Nesberg were saying, is that their motivation, again, it was for food here, changes the way we perceive the world, changes an ambiguous stimulus that could be seen as anything, and they saw it as food because they were hungry. So this increases the validity of the Gilchrist and Nesberg study. It backs up what they were saying, and that's a real strength here. However, not all completely rosy, as there are some weaknesses of the Gilchrist and Nesberg study. And here, the first is what we'd look at for ethical issues. And as I was saying earlier on, I wouldn't want to have been a participant in the study. I know it's only 20 hours, but actually 20 hours without food, you would be pretty hungry. So there's a couple of points here. The participants were asked to be part of the study. They did volunteer to be part of the study. And they said that they were okay with that. So they have got consent. However, what you would potentially say is that, did the participants really know how hungry they would be and how much distress and discomfort they would be in for not eating for 20 hours? And especially as they were then shown pictures of really, really tasty food. They also thought they were doing a matching task rather than actually doing a task that was looking at their motivation. So yeah, the participant did give informed consent, but actually they might not have understood how difficult it would have been. And so did they really have informed consent? Did they really know what they were getting into and how difficult it would be? And so the conclusion here, depriving people for food for an experiment, it may not be fair, it may not be justified. We can do things in science and psychology as long as the science justifies it and the findings justify it. You could argue that it does justify it. You could argue that actually it's an important finding, and putting a few people a bit hungry for a few hours actually justifies the means, potentially. But as an individual, would you agree with that if you were the one taking part in that study and you knew just how difficult it would be at the end? That's an unknown. And then finally, another weakness. So it's how applicable the findings are to everyday life. And so if you think about what was done here, we would, this study is looking at motivation, how motivation affects perception. So firstly, this only looked at one aspect of motivation, it looked at hunger. Does other forms of motivation affect our perception? But would that be the same if it was thirst? Some studies have found that, or if it was any other of our drives, is that really going to change our perception? That we can't tell that from this particular study. But also the way that the study was done. So what participants were doing here were judging pictures of food by their brightness. Well, how often do we actually do that in real life? Does that task have what we call mundane reality? Does it affect? Is it externally valid? Is this what we see in the real world when it comes to, one, motivation, but two, hunger? And actually, quite often when we're hungry, we're not, while we may be perceiving things on their brightness and how much we want them, actually getting an image back up to the brightness that it was. When do we actually ever do that? How can we use that? Is that valid in real life? So it suggests the results might not be valid to real hunger, to real motivation. And actually other studies and using actual food and judging real life food, that would have been a better study. And then looking at motivation in general, we need to look at other types of motivation. So hopefully that covers that study. Interesting study, interesting findings, some support, but like pretty much any study, it's not a perfect study, and we need to take other things into account as well.